Hi, everyone. This is Melanie Yazzie from Red Power Hour. This Native American Heritage Month, please consider empowering Red Media. Indigenous Peoples Day 2024 marks the 5th anniversary of the Red Nation podcast. Our podcast is a collaboration between the Red Nation and Red Media and is produced by Red Media. Red Media exists to fill the need for Indigenous media by and for Indigenous people. We are launching a GoFundMe campaign to gain support for our operational costs. Please consider empowering Red Media's work. You can also continue to support Red Media on Patreon, where you will gain access to bonus episodes of the Red Nation podcast, Red Power Hour, and many more benefits. Your support empowers Indigenous media and our podcasts. Thank you so much. Ahiahet.
So we're excited to have frequent guest of the podcast, Rebecca Nagle, back on the show to discuss her book that just came out last September, and it's titled "By the Fire We Carry." Actually, it's quite a spanning history. It's like several centuries of history. There's quite a bit of back and forth between the chapters, which I thought was pretty kind of an amazing kind of stylistic choice. How they alternated between the past and the present, slowly kind of catching up and synchronizing as the book progresses. There's a lot to talk about in this book, Rebecca, and I thanks for joining us. Yeah, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself or say anything about the book.
Osio naga gohin dawadon talek Janelle. My name's Rebecca Nagle. Daleka Yetli Gala. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I live in Tahlequah. I was born in Joplin, Missouri. Yeah, and I wrote By the Fire We Carry, the generations-long fight for justice on Native land. And it covers a 2020 Supreme Court case that resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history. And the case started in a surprising place as a murder, actually, in 1999. The convicted man was sentenced to death, and it was actually in the course of his death penalty appeals where this question of whether or not the Muskogee Nation still had a reservation came up. And ultimately, that question went all the way to the Supreme Court. And like you said, the book goes back and forth between the story of the case and the history that to me was important to include because it's why the case matters. And so it's the history of our tribes being removed from our homelands in the Southeast onto treaty territories west of the Mississippi, and then how Oklahoma was created on top of that land.
Yeah, and the beginning of the book, you really do a great job of like covering the murder. It's actually a pretty gruesome murder, which, you know, I as you read the book, you've done like meticulous on the ground reporting. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit if you could talk about the sort of method that you employed, because I know you did a podcast about this case, and some of the things that you've talked about, you know, on our podcast have detailed this case. But you know, what can you do with a book that you can't do with a podcast, especially when it comes to this kind of reporting?
That's a great question. You know, for a lot of reasons, you can do a lot more in-depth reporting. And I did, you know, for the podcast, we interviewed people, we talked to people, we looked at some court records, you know, I read some books, but really with the book that I wrote, instead of relying on kind of interviews and secondary sources, I went straight to the primary sources. So to report on the case, I pulled every document that had been filed in its 20-year history, which was binders. I had to like put a shelf in my office, like had to go to Walmart and buy a shelf to like hold all the binders of documents that I read, and, you know, went back to the original court transcripts, interviewed, you know, the police who were there, family members, community members, Patrick Murphy, the defendant himself. I spoke to him several times. And so I think that this case is a case that people will be talking about 50 years from now. And I wanted where it came from and how it happened to be well documented. And I feel like a lot of people, even people who really knew the case really well, didn't know some of these details and some of that history. And so as a reporter, I wanted to perform, I guess, that service. And I think that, you talked about how the murder was very gruesome. It also was very traumatic for the family of the murder victim and for the community around them. And I think sometimes that tragedy got lost in the way that people talked about the case and its legacy, because then it becomes this victory for tribal sovereignty, right? And I just wanted people to be able to understand the full complexity of the case and the complexity of where it came from.
Yeah, the person who was murdered was George Jacobs, and I remember you even talking about the president, or writing about the president of Muskogee Nation, even feeling sort of kind of reluctant to be party to this this larger case, but it's actually kind of indicative of a larger tradition within, I guess, federal Indian law cases, that what starts off as like a crime, you can go back to like Crow Dog, who murdered Spotted Tail, and the lack of sort of criminal jurisdiction that existed on reservations kind of brought into question like larger issues around whether the federal government or the state's government had criminal jurisdiction on Indian reservations. So these sort of like infractions then kind of raise like larger issues. And I think with Indian country, like even with Crow Dog and Spotted Tail, it's like there's like very few degrees of separation in terms of like the violence that's been inflicted internally, but also externally, through colonization, etc. That I think you detail, quite well in this book. And, one thing that I thought was fascinating is this sort of your personal like arc or your personal journey in this story. You begin with this story about spitting on, I think it's Andrew Jackson's grave, and then talking about your own familial or your own genealogy, tracing back to Major Ridge, who was considered a traitor, but then kind of hearing this different story from your grandmother about who, Major Ridge was. But then also, halfway through the book, I don't want to like do any spoiler alerts, but I thought this was kind of a fascinating turn. And rereading it the second time, I was like, I thought it was fascinating, like how this whole case centers on it's a death penalty case, right? It's a capital murder case. And you're talking about Major Ridge and how he was assassinated. Him and two of his co-conspirators, his son and I think it's Elias. I don't know how to pronounce his name.
It's Boudinot. Yeah.
Boudinot. Yeah. Elias
yeah, I
Boudinot.
think the proper pronunciation is Boudinot, but
Boudinot.
in here in Eastern Oklahoma we say Boudinot.
Yeah. And you kind of like and you didn't really elaborate too much on it, but you kind of come to the conclusion in your own family history that, Major Ridge deserved to die. And I wonder if you could maybe expand a little bit on that, because on one hand, you seem to detail the reasons why, the lawyers for,
Patrick Murphy,
make the case that he should live, through all these different, they throw everything but the kitchen sink in terms of like the arguments that they're making. And then, you kind of like justify the murder or the assassination of Major Ridge and his co-conspirators. And I wanted to just hear a little bit more about that, because I think that's kind of an unusual turn to take, I guess. And I wasn't actually expecting that when I reread this book.
Yeah, so for some background, Major Ridge is my great 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 grandfather, and John Ridge is his son. And in the 1830s, the US had this unrelenting policy of ethnic cleansing that all indigenous nations living within what was then the territorial limits of the United States would be expelled to west of the Mississippi. And originally, my family really fought against Cherokee Nation ceding any amount of land. Major Ridge even killed another chief that had illegally ceded Cherokee land, had fought wars, had fought against the U.S. militia, and then they tried diplomacy when warfare was no longer working. And then eventually they got to this place where they felt like Cherokees had no choice, and that if we tried to stay on our land, we wouldn't survive. And that the only way for Cherokees to continue both as a people and as a nation was to move west. And so they tried to convince their fellow Cherokees that that was the best option. They failed. And after a few years, they decided to sign an illegal treaty. And what's interesting is two things. One is that there are sort of two reasons under Cherokee law that that meant death. And they signed the treaty knowing that they would be killed for it. They talked about it at the time, that they knew that basically they were forfeiting their lives by making this decision. One is that under the official laws of Cherokee Nation, so, we had our traditional laws, and then we sort of adopted a written constitution in the 1820s, and really in response to colonization, changed what our self-governance looked like. And one of those changes was that if anybody illegally ceded Cherokee land, the punishment was death. And that was in response to, the U.S. trying to basically ply corruptible chiefs to sign away small amounts of land. And Major Ridge pushed for that law. And then there's an even older law, sometimes called the traditional blood law, which came from this idea that if somebody died and their death wasn't avenged, then their blood would forever cry out for justice, and they wouldn't basically have peace in the afterlife. And it actually didn't matter. Like, I think one of the things I think about is that's so interesting about indigenous justice versus like European justice is how much Europeans are obsessed with like intention and like the way that we think about crime. And I feel like in our traditional forms of justice, people just think there's a lot more focus on just what the harm was. And so it actually didn't matter if the death was like what we would call manslaughter or murder. But yeah, so the belief was that those deaths had to be avenged. And so the Ridges were killed for both of those reasons. I sort of arrived at, I was raised, especially John's death was extremely violent. He was stabbed 29 times in front of his family, his wife, and his children. And, like my grandmother's grandmother was a child in that house when that happened. And so it was like I was raised with these stories of just how wrong the assassinations were, I think, from that perspective. And I think it was in doing the research for this book that I realized that I think that they were justified. I think that they knew they were going to die. And I think they had accepted that, and that was a way for balance to be restored for what had been lost because of removal and because of the Trail of Tears. And so, which I should have said that, a lot of people see their assassinations as basically carrying out that traditional blood law for the people who died on the Trail of Tears because the treaty helped set that in motion.
Yeah, you make that argument, or you show through the evidence that had they not made that sort of side treaty with the United States, less people probably would have died. And so, that's something I actually never.
And it's like, I think it's so hard to say, right? Yeah. It's so hard to say because, the Muskogee took a different path of trying to accept land. And they were still rounded up, not under the pretense of a treaty, but under the pretense of, a small band of the tribe having a rebellion. The Seminole who took up arms, like every tribe, even the tribes that agreed to removal or had factions that agreed to removal saw huge rates of death. And so, I think one of the things that we can learn from the Ridge's stories is how unrelenting the policy of genocide was that our ancestors were facing, and how the fight that they were having amongst themselves was how best to survive genocide. And different leaders within the tribes chose different paths. And I think most tribes have these histories, right, of taking a more conciliatory path, taking a path of compromise, or taking a path of resistance. And neither path ends in justice, right? It's not about justice, it's about survival. And so I think the easy way to tell our story is that like a small group of corrupt leaders signed this treaty, and that's why the Trail of Tears happened. And I think the harder way to tell that story is that the US was hell-bent on ethnic cleansing, and at the time there wasn't much our tribe could do to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, you make that pretty clear. And I think that's what's like fascinating about this. It's like, on one hand, you do a really sort of forensic deep dive into, the murder of this individual and the sort of jurisdictional kind of question it raises. Was he killed in Indian country or not? And then you do sort of a forensic history of like colonialism and how it manifests. In many ways, the Cherokee Nation kind of experiences, like kind of vacillates between this kind of one of accommodation and, kind of outright resistance and still where it leads. Like, I think it and it's not an easy history to write. Like I can tell, somebody who's an Indigenous person, Indigenous writer confronting these histories, I can imagine like what you were going through at the time and like how you were, crafting these histories, because, you position yourself at the beginning of the book as somebody who's a descendant of, these historical figures. But nonetheless, these sort of legacies, of white supremacy, of, genocide still saturate the present. And I just wonder, like, if you could talk a little bit about like what it was like and how you coped, I guess, or managed or dealt with these very traumatic histories. I was just thinking about this, and I never read this before. It was the first time I encountered it. It was in your book that Chief Justice John Marshall actually wept, like hearing the accounts of like the genocidal violence that was being waged against Cherokee. So like here, like, I've always just kind of assumed him as this sort of astute, like, logician of colonialism. He just was creating sort of a law out of, to justify the taking of native land. But here, this man, even a kind of ardent, I guess, supporter of certain factions or certain facets of U.S. colonialism, was also deeply affected by it. And if that says, something about the colonizer, then what does it say about the people who are the targets of this particular, policy? And if you could just talk a little bit about what it was like going through those archives and reading these things, because I think even the historians that you cite here and the histories that I've read by, mostly white historians, there's a level of detachment. And you do not get that in your book at all. Like, it's very much like you're telling it from a standpoint of a Cherokee citizen, of somebody who has a vested interest.
Yeah. Yeah. It was something that I really grappled with, because the book is really violent. There's a lot of violence and a lot of different types of violence in the book. And I wanted to be really honest about how violent this history was. But I think in our culture, when you write about violence, you have to be really careful to not sensationalize it. And so I thought about that a lot. And I'm glad you talked about how different those other histories are, because obviously I read a ton about, removal and the Trail of Tears while writing this book. And I had prior, also to writing this book. And when I got into the primary sources, the level of horror, and just how barbaric and unspeakable the level of violence was that was carried out on Indigenous people when you're in the primary sources, that I think is very rarely captured in the way the history is told. And I don't know why, I don't know why that is. I think maybe some people feel like they can't speak to it, but it's interesting. A lot of the books about the Trail of Tears really have this kind of deep level of detail about the politics that led up to it often, whether it's Worcester v. Georgia, or the Treaty of Indian Springs, sort of all of these big histories. But then when you get to the actual violence that Indigenous people were facing, I feel like sometimes it gets glossed over. And I think we don't really understand the history of our country until we've really grappled with not only like what our government did, but what it's capable of. Yeah. And just the details that I read, I was just, even though I had known a lot about this history, it's still really shocking. And so I wanted to, without sensationalizing the history, help people see and feel how incredibly violent it was. I mean, I think people's understanding of the Trail of Tears is that, people had to walk a long way, and that on that walk, a lot of people died. And it's like, people were rounded up at gunpoint and put into open air stockades. Like, the army built concentration camps. It's like, it was carried out meticulously and deliberately in a way that's not just a long, hard walk, which I think is the sort of mainstream understanding of it.
Yeah, and I couldn't help but think of present day examples, and I'm sure you've gone there yourself. But if you think of, when I first went to like Palestine, for example, the level, like the amount of resources that go into keeping this occupation going is kind of mind-boggling. I think people just sort of assume that, like, even on the Western frontier, you just kind of plopped a military post out there, and it's like it was what you see in the removal period is like literally military logistics, and you have to get food. You have to feed the people who are doing the removing. You have to organize the removal. You have to like count the people. You have to do it, a taxonomy of the goods. You have to do valuations. You have to do land surveys. You have to it is a kind of mind-numbingly bureaucratic process that creates an entire archives of people's lives and an accounting. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this where you go into, there's ledgers that were created of the things that were taken, the things that were lost, the lives that were lost. And it's not a cheap enterprise. It's something that the United States, invested a lot of money in. And it wasn't just stealing land in the sense that you had some, adventurous white settlers who went out and killed a couple Indians on their own accord with their own resources. It was like, no, they were backed up by the military power of the United States. And
it works hand in hand, like to expand, the U.S. needed those settlers building illegal outposts, and to build those illegal outposts, the settlers needed militias, often, sometimes the army, that would then come and back up their illegal actions. Yeah. And so I think people don't realize how it worked in tandem as it works in the West Bank.
Yeah. And I mean, it's the level of like willpower it takes in Congress, and even through these laws. And, at the end of the day, it's like you even point out, it's this whole story. I mean, spoiler alert, the whole story is just about this quest for the United States to uphold its own laws. And I think that's too radical for most people. And we live in this era, like, I mean, we're recording in just another, contentious and polarizing presidential election, much like the time period, when Andrew Jackson was elected in many ways. But there's this kind of tendency to valorize and to almost make sacred the US Constitution. But there's not a real attempt to understand what the laws are and and how they're applied and how they're not applied. Because at the end of the day, a law is meaningless unless it's enforced. As you point out, it's not like the Supreme Court or any court has like an army at its disposal to carry out its will, or officers to carry out its will. So when it says, treaties are this, when it upholds the standard of like treaties of the supreme law of the land, or that this is still Indian country, it's not like there's some kind of federal force that's deployed to enforce these regulations. It's the law does not sit above society, and in fact, it's an expression in many ways, and both an expression of it, how it enacts justice, and both of an expression how it ignores or neglects its own laws. And I think that was kind of the conclusion I was left with after reading this in many ways, because it's such a, it's a great story. I mean, everyone should read the book. Like, there's just so many kind of twists and turns, even the way you tracked the people's lives, the lawyers, their lives and where they came from. The original lawyer was, she worked for the oil and gas industry in Texas. She was a corporate lawyer, and the people who do these death row cases, like their lives that they live, and just even the mental strain. It's like, we're totally colonized and we have a lot of mental health problems, but you even document that, on the lawyer side, like the susceptibility that some of these lawyers have to, mental health problems. It's just a really fascinating, and I think a well-rounded read in terms of you're kind of looking at all sides of the issue. And I think in a good, in a very journalistic way, but I think just kind of detailing those small aspects of people's lives to show that even though these are structures, there are, people make up the gears, people make up the cogs. They have feelings, they have, thoughts, they have problems. And I felt it was just like I felt like I knew the characters, by the end of the book, this had a deeper appreciation of the kinds of like everyday people who are just out there grinding,
Yeah. I think that's one thing I wanted to capture, of just all of the people who push the case along, and all of those sort of junctures where it could have gone in a different way. I think we think of these historic legal victories, and sometimes they do come out of decades of activism and work. And this case did too, but there's also just a lot of happenstance. And sometimes it's a person believing in something when there aren't that many other people around them that believe in it. And there were a lot of people in the early stages of this case who just didn't think that a murder with really gruesome underlying facts was going to be the case that would uphold a reservation that had been denied for a century. And it was. I wanted to talk a little bit to what you were talking about with the law. One of the things I think about a lot when it comes to law is that when it comes to the law and oppression, that where the law protects the rights of oppressed people, it is often not followed. And oppressed people and communities, I think, always find a way to recognize, to exercise their inherent rights outside of the law. And so I think when you look at what the law says and what people's lived experiences are, they don't, of course, it's deeply, deeply, deeply impacted by the law, but it's not mapped on exactly. And what we have, I would say, in the tradition of federal Indian law is a US government that's just spineless. When a tribe has something that settlers want, even when the law clearly protects the tribe, usually the settlers get what they want. And so sometimes that looks like our government ignoring the law or bending the rules. And then other times our government would come in and rewrite the law and remake the law to fit settlers' demands. And so that leaves tribes in this really tricky and precarious place where the protections that we have under US law are not enough. And yet we have to constantly fight for those protections to remain in place and just to be followed. And so when you back up and you look at this Supreme Court decision, McGirt v. Oklahoma, and that it, resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history. And it's this sort of, I think, high watermark of what the Supreme Court can do for tribes in a good way. That historical status is ironic because the Supreme Court didn't change anything. It didn't overturn anything. It didn't strike anything down. It didn't change its own rules about whether, how it decides whether or not a reservation still exists. All the court did, literally, was follow the law. And yet still, that was radical because so often the United States government doesn't do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I have complicated thoughts on a lot of this. Even reading, because you cite, Maggie Blackhawk in this, and she's written quite a bit on how the U.S. Constitution is a framework for expansion and settler colonialism in many ways, and it almost could be. And her argument is we could chalk it up to a lost cause to just say that the structure is so determined to dispossess and expropriate and seize land from Native people that it would not be worth working in it or working within that framework. But, as you cite her and, she makes the argument, it's Native people did have agency in a lot of these cases. And I appreciate, I appreciate that because I think sometimes it gets a little bit, it gets really dark, especially at this moment in time.
But I think that's so important because, and I really felt it in writing this book. And obviously, my family is part of this, so I feel it in personal ways. But what our ancestors sacrificed so that we would have a reservation, so that we would have a federally recognized tribe, so that we would have these specific treaty rights, I think we can't throw those things away as fucked up as the whole system is, And so I think it's, and I think there's a naivete in saying that it's all bad, right? I think it's just the totality of the history, and the history is brutal, and the history is genocidal, and the history is colonial, but the history is also full of indigenous resistance. And I think we do ourselves a disservice, and I think we do the sacrifices that our ancestors made a disservice when we ignore the things that have been hard fought and won.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not that we can't throw it away, but it's also not the destination.
No.
And I think even how you detail the troubled genealogy, let's put it that way, of Governor Stitt, and how somebody like him, even the very notion of an indigenous identity, and I would say more so than any other tribal nation, Cherokee Nation has its, fair share of people who falsely claim to be Cherokee. And I think some people will chalk that up to an innocence, right? To say, well, it's just a story that I heard. And you make a pretty compelling case to show that, no, this kind of claim is actually based in one of theft and genocide, and it's not an innocent claim. And can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I think some, just given your statement where it's yeah, we can't throw it away, but it's also, we have to go beyond it, because this, I think oftentimes we're put in this defensive position, even with the rampant, everyday sort of outing of what we call pretendians. sometimes we get pigeonholed as defending this really, I would say, like racist system of tribal belonging, that's determined by the federal government in the first place. And it's not like we wanted that system. It's not like we invented it. It was imposed. And it's been taken advantage of by people like Governor Stitt.
Yeah. I know. I mean, I think I think so much of what is hard about being Indigenous is that these systems are so deeply flawed, and there are alternatives that people are fighting for that are worse. And so it's like we still have to like defend the system versus the thing that is worse. And I think identity is one of those really good examples where, I think we have a lot of work to do as Indigenous nations to include people that have been excluded, whether, they've been cut off by adoption or disenrollment. We have our own very shameful history within Cherokee Nation of disenrolling freedmen descendants that we only fixed in 2017, which is really not that long ago. And at the same time, we have hundreds of thousands of people claiming to be Cherokee who are not. And that goes back really far, And so during allotment, which was when Congress decided that tribal land would be divided up and privatized and assigned to individual citizens, there were actually so we still owned our tribal land. We weren't part of any state, and we were already outnumbered on our own land by illegal white squatters when allotment came around, by some estimates by ratio of 9-1. So we were overwhelmed by white squatters. And when allotment came around and they were making the rolls for tribal citizens, a lot of those people tried to claim to be Cherokee. And some of those, a very notorious case of fraud was the family of the Dawsons, who they had actually gotten enrolled in the 1880s. And by many accounts, it was by bribing a clerk of Cherokee Nation. They didn't have any evidence of Cherokee ancestry. And the federal government had the ultimate say of whether or not they would be on what's called the Dawes rolls. The federal government decided that they should be. And then Kevin Stitt descends from those people. And because we use lineal descent from the Dawes rolls, he is eligible to enroll in Cherokee Nation and is a citizen of our tribe. And so it's just, I don't know why Cherokee. I think there are a lot of different and complicated reasons, but I think it's one of the things that, just sort of going back to our conversations about law and sovereignty, I think this fight over Native identity, I think, is a really good example of how Indigenous nations, the sort of pressure cooker that we're under, where we can't just have this like, oh yes, everyone is welcome, like if you have a Native ancestor, we'll include you, because unfortunately that includes so many people who aren't Native. And then we see on the alternative side sort of this identity policing that some people who are very toxic have taken up is also really harmful and detrimental to our communities. And so I think that sometimes that pressure, that external pressure, can make it so much harder for us to build the type of healthy communities that we deserve. Yeah. And so I think that's part of the tragedy of those false claims.
But I would also add, though, that like the histories that you talk about like disenrolling or not allowing, freedmen to enroll, or even these really traumatic stories of family separation and adoption out, those are real histories that these pretenders like exploit. And it's so like disgusting, because I've actually read, I've encountered this in real life, where people will cite, well, the Cherokee Nation is anti-Black, or, well, tribal enrollment is a racist, paradigm based on blood quantum. And it's like, okay, yeah, there's truth to that, but that's not what we're talking about here, and in fact, I think what it gets to the heart of, kind of what you're saying, is like there's this complete misunderstanding of any idea of collective rights in this country, because the Constitution of the United States is not based on collective rights. There's only 3 groups in the United States that became citizens as groups, and that's Mexican Americans, that's African Americans, and Native Americans. Everyone else came in as an individual, and it's not just a legal arrangement or a legal relationship with the federal government. It is also a social and cultural relationship. So when we begin to talk about, this idea, like everyone's like, oh, well, I'm the individual identity of, Cherokee or Lakota or whatever, or Indigenous. It's like as if it's their individual rights that are being violated. And there's no understanding that this is a collective right, much as it's a collective right of tribal nations to not only keep their land, but also to keep their children and their families together. But it just does not, it's like it highlights that forever contradiction, if you will, in like federal Indian law and policy, that we're operating under a constitutional framework that just simply does not favor the collective rights, and in fact is adamantly opposed to them and trying to constantly destroy them.
I think that that's one thing too that I feel like people on the left can also often miss the mark when it comes to tribal sovereignty, because I think that people think about fighting for marginalized groups, whether it's, people of color or LGBTQ folks, as fighting for the rights of the individual and this idea of equity. And for tribal sovereignty, it's a really different structure, because it's not, the rights aren't held by the person, they're held by the tribe. And there's this way where sometimes what is best for the tribe, there's that aspect of self-determination for the tribe that's different than I think how other people see it. And one of the people that I criticize somewhat in the book is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I talk about her legacy on the Supreme Court. And I think there's this decision she made in her career that I think really illustrates this tension, which was, and I'm forgetting which Pueblo it was, that there was a Pueblo who allowed the children of intermarried men to enroll, but not the children of intermarried women. And the ACLU intervened in the case against the tribe. And, while Ruth Bader Ginsburg was working at the ACLU, she wanted to fight for the equality of women. But what that federal intervention, which they actually lost the case, but what the case was asking for was for the federal government to intervene and tell the tribe how they should do their citizenship, which of course there is a long and very violent history of the federal government telling tribes who can and can't enroll. And what tribes generally ask is, for the federal government to stay out of it. And so I think that example shows where that disconnect often is there. It is where that disconnect often is on the left. And you can see that in the career, and I think in the jurisprudence of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, where often she just doesn't understand tribal sovereignty and federal Indian law. And so she's grasping at other legal concepts, whether it's latches or taxation or something like that, versus writing from a place of understanding and grounding in federal Indian law. And I think in terms of a policy wise and also culturally, that's something that continues to be a disservice to Indigenous nations and undermine tribal sovereignty.
Yeah, we'll get land acknowledgements, but not the land back, the kind of thing where it's like looking at disadvantaged people, or framing, I guess, Indigenous people as sort of disadvantaged, one that can be sort of ameliorated through, and I'm not speaking against affirmative action by any means, but one that can be ameliorated through these sort of like individual sort of, yeah, let's acknowledge this, let's say this is wrong, but then not really fully understanding like the kind of magnitude of these cases and what they actually mean for Native people. Like the case you're citing is, I think it's Santa Clara, Pueblo, yeah, v. Martinez, and you talk a little bit about this in the book, where it's like the kind of marriage and I guess enrollment or membership rules, were matrilineal in terms of like they trace through the mother, but a lot of Cherokee men were marrying out, and they changed the law. They just adapted. And like, I think there's this kind of like, there's this idea that somehow tribal sovereignty is supposed to be sort of static, or like even indigenous rights, when you really get down to it, like even if this happens, this critique happens from both the left and the right. Like even some of the comments from the Supreme Court justices and the most recent, cases on ICWA, they would talk about like, well, there was no real laws. These people were just kind of like savages, and how can we recognize laws when they didn't necessarily exist? And so if we're going to uphold tribal sovereignty, and if you look culturally in this country, tribalism is a bad word. It's kind of, it's associated with warfare, or it's associated with factionalism and division and the absence of rule of law. And when you kind of like boil down those perceptions into like what they're actually saying, it's like, yeah, like it can look regressive when you're, advocating for tribal sovereignty in an area that sort of contravenes sort of the normative assumptions of like what could be like civil rights, and it's also, but it ignores the context. And there's actually a good book by Joanne Barker. She really breaks down the Santa Clara Pueblo v. Martinez case, and sort of looks at it from the, I guess, traditionalist perspective of marriage and belonging to the tribe, which was replaced by a sort of Christian, patriarchal sort of order. But those things are always lost in these cases because they're determined, as you just pointed out, by somebody like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who admitted that she just doesn't know that much about, federal Indian law. And many of these Supreme Court justices, it's kind of like left up to chance whether or not they had any background in these cases. And I want to get your perspective on that, because this can't be a healthy or a sustainable sort of legal front in the future, because it's going to be totally left up to chance. It's going to be left up to who's president and who dies at what while sitting in these lifetime appointments. So what is you end the book in a kind of a bleak way, but what is like your sort of hope in this particular moment, especially given that there's not really momentum to reform this institution. There's been minor reforms, but for Indian people, it's always been haphazard at best, and just a game of chance.
So since the 1950s, tribes and tribal interests have lost a majority of the cases that went before the Supreme Court. And in the 90s, that number grew. So tribes or tribal interests have lost 2/3 of all cases that have gone before the Supreme Court. And, I think of the way the U.S. treats indigenous nations, and when you look at U.S. policy, often it's this pendulum swing. And so, you have allotment in the boarding school era, and then people saying, oops, that was wrong. And you have the termination era, and then people saying, oops, that was wrong. And so what you start to see in the 1970s come from Congress, while far from perfect, is better than the previous era of termination. And you start to see policies that start to do more good than harm. And at the same time, you start to see huge setbacks for tribal sovereignty come from the Supreme Court. So gutting tribal jurisdiction and the ability of tribes to prosecute non-natives, doing the same thing with civil jurisdiction. So it's much, much, much harder for tribes to regulate things like businesses and pollution on our lands. And that trajectory comes clear up to the present day. And, one of the things I read about the book is also just that one of the barriers for tribes at the Supreme Court is just the sheer ignorance of the justices. And, you had current Chief Justice John Roberts in a case in 2013, basically betraying the fact that he does not really know what a federally recognized tribe is or how tribal citizenship works, including asking a question that if someone feels like they're Cherokee, if they can be a citizen of a federally recognized Cherokee tribe. Even more recently, Justice Alito made a comment that before the arrival of Europeans, indigenous nations were all at war with each other, as if Europeans are who brought peace to this continent. And so I agree with what you're saying. I think that the ignorance of the justices is a huge barrier for tribes at the Supreme Court. And I think, you sort of have these sort of competing modes of the Supreme Court, which I think is also sort of the two competing ways that the U.S. treats indigenous nations, which is sometimes it adheres to its own constitution and its own laws, which recognize the inherent sovereignty of tribes. And sometimes it throws those things out of the window and railroads tribes just because it can. And I think you see that those competing doctrines in the modern era up to the present day. We had the 2020 McGirt decision where, again, the Supreme Court just followed the law, upheld the reservation of Muskogee Nation. It was this historic victory. And then on the heels of that, just 2 years later, you had Castro Huerta and the Supreme Court. I mean, that decision was so messy that, it openly contradicted previous Supreme Court decisions. But instead of saying, hey, we're overturning this decision, or this is why we're departing from precedent, Kavanaugh, who authored the decision, just ignored them and pretended like they didn't exist. And so legally, in so many ways, that decision was so messy. And I think what we have in our present political discourse is this growing concern about the Supreme Court, especially, after the fall of Roe and the repeal of a constitutional right to an abortion. All of a sudden people are talking about how the court needs to be reformed, how the court is corrupt. There are these scandals. Public faith in the court has plummeted to historic lows. And part of the argument that I make in the book is that these trends had been happening when it came to indigenous nations before everybody else was paying attention. And if more people had been paying attention when it was happening to tribes, maybe something could have been done about it sooner.
Yeah, it's like kind of one of those things where it's like you don't know what you don't know. It's almost, I teach a federal Indian policy course, and I also teach a federal Indian law course. I'm not a lawyer by any means, but one of the fascinating things about going back into reading these primary documents is just the admission. Like even, under the Rehnquist court, one of the rulings, I think it was the Tehitan ruling, one of the judges was just like, well, every American schoolboy knows. And it's like, that's his intellectual logic about why tribes don't have sovereignty.
Yeah. And they should be embarrassed. Yeah. They should be embarrassed by the level of their ignorance. And they're not, I think it's starting to change. I think like Sotomayor and honestly, Gorsuch being on the bench and knowing their stuff, both in the way that they ask questions and in the way that they write, it is starting to change that. I think things have gotten slightly better, maybe, in terms of just the level of ignorance at oral arguments. But yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court justices should be embarrassed that they are supposedly experts in American law and the depth of their ignorance about federal Indian law. But, because of the way that power works, they don't have to be.
Yeah. And, somebody like Gorsuch is, even though he can read Indian law pretty well, he's a double-edged sword because he, he struck down Roe, but his like personal beliefs are pretty abhorrent. Even if you read it through the lens of tribal sovereignty, like in the cutting down of Roe v. Wade, and I think you've pointed this out, even on Indian reservation, you want to grant the authority or delegate the authority back to states, but like tribes have no authority whatsoever when it comes to that because of the Hyde Amendment. So it's always this like contradiction. It's like you can't. It's always, I don't know. I just don't have the faith. I mean, I don't think I've ever had the faith in it, and I'm really awe-inspired by people like lawyers who do work through the system, because we do need lawyers. I'm not saying that we don't need lawyers, but I'm also just like, I don't know how law can be, how courts can be the avenue, for reform. And that's not what you're saying in this book by any means, but I think sometimes there is this sort of overemphasis on kind of like trying to figure out the psyches of these people who probably just should not have the authority that they have, in my opinion. And so it just becomes kind of a guessing game at the end of the day, or a game of chance, because you could get somebody could pass away or retire, and you could get somebody much worse, or you could get somebody much better. And I think it lends itself to a larger question, not just for, federally recognized tribes, but for people in general, that there's sort of a lack of imagination about something that could be different, like in terms of a constitutional authority. Tribes for damn sure need something that's better than the Constitution or just the acts that we have right now, because we're not going to get anything. I mean, that's basically what we're told. We're not going to get anything out of these Congresses. It's too hostile. It's too divisive, that we're not going to get the substantial reform that we need. And if you look at Indian country today, it's like, after COVID-19, the life expectancy of American Indians in this country has dropped drastically by like upwards to 6 years. And the epidemiological studies that are being conducted are finding that trend actually began before COVID. So these are like structural issues. And, in my home state, South Dakota, the median age is 58 years old for an American Indian person. These should be like alarm bells. And, I think it's Felix Cohen who you cite. I could be wrong. You don't attribute the author, but it's
Felix Cohen.
Yeah, it is. That's how big of a nerd I am. I didn't even look in the back of the book. I swear to God, in the notes. But he says like federal Indian law is like the canary in the coal mine. And I would say in many ways that even like native health in general, like both in all aspects of that, whether it's our social health, our actual health, is sort of indicative of, where this society is at. And I think that, just having been to places that have reformed their constitution, especially when it comes to indigenous rights, the United States is so far behind. I'm just very pessimistic, because to have that sort of constitutional change, it's like, look at what Chile had to undergo. Their constitution was modeled after the U.S. Constitution. It was like not meant to ever be reformed or redrafted. And I don't know if we live in a political climate that could offer itself or lend itself to a progressive movement that, even if it captured just like a sizable portion of U.S. society, would never be enough to kind of push it in the direction that it needs to go. And I'm not trying to sound gloom and doom, but I just want to know how you feel about this particular moment that we're in, because and where your work is going in all of it.
Yeah. I just think we're in a weird political moment that also it feels like we've been in for a while, where the center keeps moving further to the right as the right keeps moving further to the right. I've had times of optimism of thinking, okay, maybe we're going to get some big wins and some structural changes. And it feels, I don't know. I was thinking the other day about how one of the things that feels hard about the political moment that we're in is that, obviously we're living through the backlash to, the racial reckoning of 2020 and the Me Too movement and things like that. And what's hard about already being in the backlash is what was won in those times was mostly symbolic. And we didn't see a lot of more structural change. Not that there wasn't any policy change, but the big wins were, taking a statue down, renaming a school, versus more structural and policy change. And so we're already in the backlash to something where we didn't win a whole lot. And then in terms of tribes, I think we're still in a place where the things that we're fighting for are really basic. And so I think it's easy to be jaded about it, but I think that those basic wins are still important. I think the place where we're starting with, the average US citizen is basic information and basic knowledge. I think we're in a place where people finally realize that what they kind of know about indigenous nations is wrong. I don't think most people still think the story of Columbus and Pocahontas as has been told to them is correct. I think people know that their understanding is off and that they don't know, which I think is progress, but I don't think that they have anything filling in those gaps, if that makes sense. And so, as a journalist, I think a lot about public information and the stories that we tell and how those stories shape culture and also shape policy. And I think we're still dealing with a lot of just erasure of Native people. And so, just whether it's all of the little ways that voters get dissected and it's, suburban women who don't have children in Philadelphia or something like that, suburban white women who like wine, but no one's talking about Native voters when it's whether it's the Senate race in Montana or the presidential race in Arizona, Native voters are going to play a decisive role in the outcome in this election and aren't getting talked about. Or, you briefly mentioned affirmative action, Native enrollment at Harvard fell by half and nobody's talking about it. And so it's just those things, I think we're still fighting for that basic recognition and that basic inclusion. When you think about the information culture that we're living in. And I think those things translate into policy. What politician is going to prioritize us if they don't see us as a key constituency when it comes to voting? What university is going to think progressively about enrolling more Native students if there's not even no public pressure, but no even just public conversation about them needing to do that? And so, yeah, I think we just still have a ways to go. But to have a more hopeful note, God, that was kind of doom and gloom. I think I see a lot coming from tribes that I think is really inspiring, whether it's tribes thinking really progressively about climate change and natural resources or doing work around language. And so, I think there's a lot coming from our communities that gives me hope.
Yeah, as your book points out, this isn't the worst situation we've been in. This isn't also the worst presidency, or hasn't, the last couple of presidencies. There's been much worse. It doesn't mean that we say this is a level of accomplishment. I think what the point of the book is that it's it shows you how people actually endure and adapt and continue to carve out that space despite the onslaught of genocide. And in fact, I think that's why, if people want to know why there isn't, there's a media blackout about the Palestinian narrative or Palestinian perspective, all you have to do is just look at your own history and why you don't know your own history and of this land in particular. There's, amidst the book banning and everything, we are living in pretty terrible times, but I also find more hope in the I guess just the continuing tradition of, people who are just putting it out there and not really pandering to that sort of expectation that we, have to ask, like the white liberals, if it's okay to do this X, Y, and Z. We're beyond that right now. We're seeing that sort of crumble, like that whole edifice, of this caring white liberal. And I'm not like, this isn't Nick Estes moving to the right. I think it's just the mask is off in this moment. And I think people see it for what it is. And if there's any group of people in the United States that has knows what to do in these moments and times, it's indigenous nations. For better or worse, it's not to say that we have the solution. I think, and you pointed out the climate catastrophe, and I don't think our ancestors were really prepared for this or equipped to handle this kind of scale of disaster. But nonetheless, we have the foundation of how to deal with it and how to survive it. But I don't want to get on my platform because this is about your book. And I just want to say, Rebecca, this book was actually really amazing, very well written, very readable, and very well argued and thought out in its construction and its execution. And, the power of it, I think the most powerful part of it is that photograph that you have sitting in the kitchen of some aunties, because that's where the true power and true sovereignty lies. But it was kind of like a nice little kind of like breakup, because it's like death, death, death. And then it's like, you're in the kitchen of some aunties who are making fried bread.
They made some beans.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, those women from Weagupke grounds are really cool. Yeah. They're really fun to hang out with. And, and it's like they just even that, like the things that that was my favorite part of reporting the book, was getting to know people, people like Rosemary in the book, who's, holds a language camp at her house once a year to teach people Muskogee, and all the work that people are doing to protect Native culture and language and sovereignty. Because, there's the sovereignty that we have under US law, and then there's also the sovereignty that we exercise, right? And so I think that that those people who are keeping that stuff alive is really important. And also to like talk about hope for a minute. There's a quote that's not mine, but it's in the book. And I interviewed Suzanne Harjo, and she said this thing that just, I will never forget. And she was talking about how, this McGirt decision came after more than a century of Oklahoma saying, you don't have a reservation, you don't have a reservation, you don't have a reservation. And for her, that century is this lesson about how, as Native people, we can't be deterred by the losses we face, even if it's a century of loss. And this thing she said that I can't forget is, we are on a longer timeline anyways. We're on a longer timeline than other people's are in this country. And that's a longer timeline going backwards, but it's also a longer timeline going forward. And things will get straightened out along the way. And I think that's a perspective that, maybe we can bring in this moment to have hope. If anybody deserves to be optimistic about the future, it's Suzanne Harjo, for all of the amazing work that she did in her life. Has done in her life. She's amazing.
Yeah. Somebody who is, at the end of her journey here and has done so much. I mean, still has a steel trap mind,
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful, place to end it, Rebecca, because, this, if you're listening, if you made it this far, pick up the book. Is there anything else that you want to prop up, Rebecca? Do you have a place that, if you want to send folks to a social media account or a website?
Yeah, totally. People can follow me. I'm just at Rebecca Nagle on Instagram and Twitter. And check out the book wherever you get your books, audio, ebook, and hardcover.
Well, thanks so much for joining the podcast. again.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's always good to talk to you, Nick.
Cool.